Hi, I'm Christine from Remake and welcome to the second in our series of repair videos. Today, as you may be able to see from the background, we're actually filming in the Remake scrap store. Remake is a charity which is dedicated, amongst other things, to preventing a lot of our stuff going into landfill. And here we have a store full of wonderful goodies which have been donated by the public or by businesses and are available for you to buy at very reasonable prices. You can check out our website for details of our opening hours. So today we are going to talk about seams, the splitting of seams and the fixing of seams. Seams are where our pieces of material put together to make our garments, and they are therefore potentially weak points, which can spring apart. So I'm going to start by showing you two different types of seams that you are likely to find on garments in your wardrobe and places where they may come apart. So I have a nice pair of trousers here. I'm going to bring this up to the camera and I'm going to show you this. Now this is a traditional seam where the two pieces of the fabric have been put together like this. They have been sewn along and the seam has been pressed open. The edges of the fabric are finished off so they don't fray. Now this is a traditional seam and you will find it on trousers, for example, in the crotch seam, which goes round between your legs because it's nice and flat and comfortable. Sometimes you'll get it on the inside leg seams as well. What you're more likely to find on most garments nowadays is this kind of seam, which is also on these trousers, which is an overlocked seam. Now you can see this is not flat, it's slightly ridgy. And this is what most garments are, how most garments are made nowadays. They're made on industrial overlockers. They are very secure seams. They don't often come apart, although when they do, you still need to fix them. And they're very quick. The disadvantage is that they don't lie as flat, so therefore they're not always as comfortable as traditional seams. If you do any sewing yourself, or have done in the past, and you've made a garment, you will have sewn it with this kind of flat traditional seam. So I'm going to show you first of all how to fix this kind of seam that's split. Then I'm going to show you how to fix an overlocked seam. The places where things are most likely to split are around the seat of your pants, the places where there's most movement. So around the seat of your pants, perhaps around the shoulder seams of a blouse if it's a little tight, or if you have very large shoulders. You can use cotton as well. Small pair of scissors, and if you want to mark where you're going to sew, a ruler and a ballpoint pen or a pencil. I've also used today some embroidery floss, which is a thicker thread. You would not use this normally for sewing a seam, but if you've nothing else, it will work. Okay, so the first demonstration I'm going to do today is to show you how to repair a traditional seam. So one where you have the two sides pressed together and the seam has split open, as you can see. So the first thing you want to do is to make sure that you have the edges close together. If you're lucky enough to still have the crease in place where it was stitched before, then use that. If not, give it a good press. Make sure your edges are matched up. And then I'm going to put a couple of pins in. I'm not putting them on the line where I'm going to stitch. There's the seam line there. I'm just going to put them there just to hold the edges of the fabric together so that it doesn't shift around while I'm stitching it. Now, if you're not a very experienced sewer, you might find it's quite hard to follow just a crease line like that. So on this side, this is like Blue Peter. Here's something I had prepared earlier. So we're going to sew this seam and repair it. Now, if you're not very confident about being able to sew in a straight line and to be able to keep your stitches at a reasonably consistent size, then what I've done here is I've just drawn the seam line on with a ballpoint pen. Don't use a felt tip in case it bleeds through your fabric and you can see it. So a pencil or a ballpoint is fine. And I'm just going to pin the edges just to make sure that it stays in place. Now I have marked my stitches here as well, and I've done those marks at 5 millimeters apart. which is bigger than ideal, but it will enable you to see what I'm doing, and it keeps the stitch size fairly consistent. And I'm also using a thicker thread. I'm using an embroidery thread in a very contrasting colour so that you can see it. So I'm going to make my loop at the end, pass my needle through to get my little knot. Now the knot is there just to stop the thread from pulling through. It's not totally secure. And we're going to go back a little bit into where the stitching is already. You don't start just at the beginning of the hole. Go back a little bit. You know, maybe about, I don't know, what's that, about a millimetre, a centimetre or so. So needle goes into the fabric. The knot stops it slipping through, but we're not going to just leave it at that. We're going to secure it with 2 tiny stitches on top of each other. That just means that your sewing will not come unravelled later on. And we're going to do a back stitch here. It's called a back stitch because it goes back on itself, and it's probably the nearest thing in hand stitching to what a sewing machine will produce, and it's quite secure and quite neat. So I'm going to go in at my first mark, and I'm coming out at the second one. Don't pull your thread too tight like that, or you'll get your fabric puckering. You just want to keep it nice and smooth. And then I'm going to go back into the same place as my thread went into before, and this time I'm coming out at the next mark, which is there. Pull it flat but not tight, and then I'm going to go back into that hole again and out at the next one. Now you can see the advantage of having these marks, so if you're not very confident with this kind of thing, it keeps you in a nice straight line, and it keeps your stitches of a more or less equal length. So we're going back into the previous stitch and out at the next mark. And you can see we get a nice, even and straight row of stitching. I'm just going to do a couple more. Everyone holds the fabric in slightly different ways when they're sewing. You just do whatever is comfortable for you. Okay, so there we've done a couple of inches. So I'm going to take the pins out and have a look and see what is happening on the other side. So when we open our seam out, so you can see there is the original seam, nice and tight and flat, and there is the part we've just sewn. Now, because I haven't finished it off, if I pull it, it will come apart. But as you can see, it's lying nice and flat. We can see the stitches, but that's only because I've used a thick and contrasting thread, and you would not do that. But once we've sewn that up, the seam will be continuous again and as good as new. Don't forget though, when you come to the end of your seam, just to overlap it a little bit into the existing stitching and a couple of stitches on top of each other to finish off your thread before you cut it. Right, for the second demonstration, I'm going to do it as you would on a normal seam. So again, we have a gap in the seam there where the stitching has come out for whatever reason, maybe too many ice creams. But this time I'm going to sew it with a regular length stitch, not the long one that I used on the last. I'm going to use a regular thread. The thread I used on the other one to show you what was happening was an embroidery thread, which is much thicker. This is standard sewing thread. It's 100% polyester, although you can get cotton ones as well. It's a good quality thread, doesn't break easily. Okay, so we're going to, and again, I'm using a contrast colour just so that you can see it. So I'm going to start again by making my little knot, make a loop, pass it through, pull it tight, clip the ends. Now I haven't marked this one, and I'm not pinning it either because I've done this a million times. But please feel free to do it. So again, I'm going to go back just into where the stitching is before. Put my needle through, scissors are coming too. 2 little stitches on top of each other to secure the end of the thread. and then I'm going to backstitch. Now this time I don't have a guide. I'm going to go in and out. I'm going to go back to where the previous stitch was. Now you can see I'm using a much shorter length stitch this time, possibly, oh, don't know, maybe 3mm, something like that. Perhaps 1/8 of an inch if you're an old person like me and don't think in metric. But it's exactly the same process, just a little bit more fiddly perhaps because I'm doing it more delicately and neatly. So again, back stitching, going back to the hole, the previous one, out a bit further along and back. And again, we'll go all the way to the end and again secure the thread at the end with a couple of stitches on top of each other. I'm only going to go that far because I don't want this to look like paint drying. A couple of stitches, clip the thread, then let's just open it up and see what it looks like, and there we have it. Now because I've done a smaller stitch this time, even though I have used a contrasting colour thread, even if I pull it you can barely see where I've sewn it because I've used a really small stitch. Lastly, we're going to look at an overlocked seam that's come apart. Now, overlocked seams are actually pretty strong, but they still can disintegrate from time to time. I've had to actually unpick these. So there is where the seam has come apart. There's the overlocking, nice and neat and nice and strong, and of course stretchy. This is a stretch fabric. So I've unpicked some of the overlocking here and we're just going to back stitch that. But what I've also done down here, this is what's possibly more likely to happen with an overlocked garment. So I'm just going to have to flip it around. And that is not that the stitching comes out, but that the fabric wears out next to the stitching. This is very likely to happen with things like sweatpants or something that you've probably had for a long time. The fabric's getting a bit old and tired, but you really like the garment, so you don't want to lose it. So if you have that sort of situation, what you have to do is just slightly overlap the fabric. Now you won't get a perfect seam doing it this way, but we're just going to slightly overlap it. I'm going to ignore the overlocking completely, and I'm just going to treat this as if it's a new seam. The only problem you might have is at the end where you've got a kind of a little glitch going on. So you have to kind of graduate the seam in and along. So I'm going to show you how to do this one. So I've got it overlapped. I'm just going to stick a pin in, just for security, just to hold it in place. And again, I'm going to go back. So I'm going to go back to where the stitching is secure. I'm using a contrasting thread again. I have my knot. Couple of securing stitches, and then I'm going to back stitch along here. Now again, if you don't feel very secure about being able to follow that line, you can draw it on. So I'll just do that. So I'm going to line up the end of my ruler with this part here where it's already stitched, and I'm going to go to up to there where it is still stitched, and I'm just going to draw. It's not working terribly well. Oh, well, it's not a perfect line, but never mind. You can roughly see where I'm going. So I've kind of drawn a line on just to let me see where I'm going to stitch. And I'm going to do exactly the same before. I'm going to do a back stitch all the way along. Now, the beauty of this fabric, it's a knit fabric. So like t-shirts, sweatpants, all those kind of things are made out of a knit rather than a woven fabric. That gives them stretch and makes them very comfortable to wear. But from a sewing point of view, it has the advantage that the edges do not fray or unravel. So although this has been overlocked and nicely finished, we don't have to worry about this edge not being finished because it's not going anywhere. Nothing is going to happen to it. So I'm just going to continue along my very rough line. And again, I'm doing quite a small stitch. I hope you can see the length of that. I'm going to take the pins out as I go. And by the way, if you are using pins, and in fact anything that you use in sewing, please make sure it is sharp. If you only have some rusty old pins that have been lying around your house for goodness knows how long, or if you've inherited your granny's pins and they're a bit past their best, keep them for sentimental reasons if you want, but don't use them. Blunt or rusty pins and needles will just make your life harder. So make sure they're nice and sharp and nice and clean. I always use these pins with the bigger heads because I'm getting very ancient. I like to see what I'm doing. If you do get pins with heads like this, make sure they are glass heads and not plastic ones. The reason for that is because the ones with plastic heads tend to be quite poor quality, and if you do by any chance iron them, which in this part of the mending course you're not going to, but you might later on, they will melt, which is not a good idea. So glass-headed pins, if you want to buy those. They're not expensive. Nothing to do with sewing really is that expensive, and it's not worth skimping on them. And of course, if you come and do your shopping in the Remake scrap store, if you're in this area, then you can get lots of these things for a very small amount of money. Now you can see I'm coming to the end here, where this has sort of come adrift slightly. So I'm just going to push that up with my needle just to keep it on top so that we have something to sew into. And I'm carrying on, whoops, right to the end. I'm going to take it all the way to the end this time so that we'll see what the completed job looks like. So I'm just making sure that I'm catching in all that fabric at the end so we don't end up with a wee hole there. And that should do it. Okay, so I'm finishing off with a couple of stitches on top of each other to secure my thread. Cut the thread. Now let's have a look on the right side and see what's happened here. Okay, so it's not too bad. Now you can see that it's not as perfectly flat as where we mended the other seam, because we've had to overlap the fabric slightly, but it works. The seam is secure, it doesn't look too bad. You can see my stitching, but that's only because it's in a bright colour, and that would be pretty much invisible if I'd used a matching colour. If you're not a big sewer and you don't have a huge supply of thread in different colours, I would recommend that you buy something in a neutral colour, like a mid-beige or a mid-grey colour, because that will cover most eventualities without being too obvious. Okay, so that's our overlocked seam repaired.